I've got the title Big Picture, Global Trends to 2030 and Their Impact in the UK. So I've got to somehow set the scene, get everyone worked up, and hopefully then let the very great number and quality of speakers who are following me to dig deep and think about these implications of bigger space. And when I was thinking last night, you know, where does one take a comment like this, global trends through to 2030, the impact in the UK, to try and frame it in a way that is more than just a ramble and a list of statistics and comments is quite difficult, actually. But I suppose my bottom line thought this morning as I got up was that the next 12 years will undoubtedly be a period of profound transition. Now, you could probably have said that at any time, you know, in history to stand up and give a talk like this. But I think it is rare, certainly in my experience, in my lifetime working in the policy advisory, the policy analysis world, that we've seen so many transitions take place in so many sectors simultaneously, whether in the political sphere, the geopolitical sphere, the economic sphere, the technological sphere, environmental sphere, all happening simultaneously, number one. And the other part, that things that have been talked about for at least the last 10, 15 years. And when I was at CSIS in Washington, I was part of a duo that used to give a thing called the 7 Revolutions presentation, what the world would look like actually we did go pretty much up to 2030. It was meant to be a long look. It was all about what was going to happen, what could happen. We used to talk about the world of hyper-promise and hyper-peril, and this is 14, 15 years ago. When I look at it today, I feel we're in a phase where we can't just talk about it. Those transitions are now in play. They're happening. And in the next 12 years, we will have made choices that will have absolutely defined the world of 2030 and what it's going to be or will not be. Some of those choices, to be frank, are made already. But a number of them, including for the United Kingdom, will be critically important in this intervening phase. So let me say some words about what those global trends are. I'll try to be as engaging as I can on it and quick, and then talk a little bit about how they're playing out in the field of geopolitics, and then come a little bit into what it means for the United Kingdom and the kind of choices that we will be discussing, you will be discussing through the course of the day. I think there are two sort of structural uber trends that are worth absorbing right now, that have been talked about for, as I said, at least the last 15 years. The first is demographic change, and the other is the spread of technological progress. And on demographic change, the feature that seems to be dominant right now is the aging of the world. It's not so much the growth of the world. Growth of the world population, as you all know, is pretty much limited into sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, a few parts of South Asia. But really across the bulk of the rest of the world, whether developing, emerging, or developed, we have a slowdown. At the same time, we have this remarkable burst of technological progress, this kind of ramp line that's taking up almost like a rocket-propelled process of change. And to me, the big question is, will those two trends, as they play out, allow the persistence of the integrated markets, of the kind of rise of connectivity that we've seen and that have been such a feature of the last 15, 20 years, certainly since the end of the Cold War? Or will they actually be the advent of a new period of geopolitical conflict, of protectionism, of maybe the collapse of major power, and of the experience of the impacts of climate change in a really negative sense, deeply, profoundly negative sense, rather than just in their disruptive sense that we're seeing today. And I really do think we're at a kind of hinge point in terms of those two futures. The demographic change, the technological change is going to happen whatever, and the disruptive effects of climate will happen whatever. But the kind of world that's a sort of an absolute gain world versus a zero-sum negative world, that is still in the balance. On the plus side, again, on these big global trends, all things being equal, there's some very good news stuff out there. Global middle classes are growing. Economic opportunity, welfare continues to spread through the world. Global middle classes are predicted, and middle classes is not much more than $10, $15 a day, if you look at them globally, are predicted to rise from about 2 billion of today's world population to 5 billion out of an 8.3 or so billion world population in the world of 2030 that we're looking at today. The net effect, and James mentioned this at the beginning, is that Europe and America's share of global GDP is going to decline to the 30 or 25% by 2030. So that bulk of that growth is in emerging markets. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, just to state the obvious, we're just realigning population and GDP. And that's a good thing, net for the world, that those many billions around the world now have greater opportunity for economic growth and welfare than before, and the net effect is going to be we will have a larger component of that mix. That's the positive. But on the risky side, the danger is that a lot of that new middle class is what many people call the near poor, that they're in a really precarious and fragile situation, including in emerging, and especially in emerging markets around the world. And that proportion of the near poor, the people living on the $5 a day, $3 to $5 a day level, above the $1 to $2 a day of absolute poor, that proportion of near poor has grown just in the last 2 decades up to today from 15 to 25% of the world's working population. And the bulk of unemployment globally, the bulk of growth of unemployment, is in East Asia and South Asia. So you have this paradox that a lot of where the growth is taking place, we're also seeing a rising unemployment. Africa is probably the absolute test case of this. It will have a larger working age population than China by 2030. But will that working age population have opportunities, or will they be cast into a world of concern? And that, of course, really comes down to technology again. Automation, machine learning systems, I mean, these are creating great pressures on us in the West. We have our own near poor in what is now called the JAMS, the just about managing. It's at a different level, obviously, of welfare, but nonetheless, that sense of precariousness is now as present as we know in our societies, with the fear of short-term contracts, the gig economy, and the fear of persistent unequal societies. And that demographic change that is affecting the whole world is especially pronounced today in the West, where it really presents a fundamental challenge to one of the glues of our societies, which is the concept of a welfare state, of social markets. The idea in particular in Europe that we'd invented a sort of virtuous, perfect setup of a market economy that was socially concerned, and the welfare state has been the absolute linchpin of this. So we are at a precarious moment, to be frank, between opportunity and peril. I think one of the big worries for us in the West, and particularly for the UK, given some of the narrative we've had around Brexit, my net is that we cannot rely on the emerging markets to be the solution to the West's growth. And that applies as much to the UK as it does to any other part of the world. And debt is an interesting part of this story, if you want to pick up another big global trend. The growth of debt in the world grew by 70 trillion to about 240 trillion through that period of the post-global financial crisis. So it's not just been an unwinding, there's been an unwinding of private and corporate debt in the West, but there's been an uptake globally of government debt in particular in the West and private and corporate debt in the emerging markets, now roughly 3 times global GDP, 320% of global GDP. And it's growing currently at 5% a year. And when you think that global growth, okay, this is a big term and it covers many spikes and pits, global growth has been averaging now around 3.5% per annum. Maybe it'll tweak towards 4%. So Larry Summers came with that famous phrase, secular stagnation. It has many plays into it, but obviously that's one of the big fears. And despite this world of precariousness, which in many cases drives many people into thinking about themselves, we are in a world of rising interdependence. And I don't need to go through all of the examples, you know it well. In fact, it's the subject of many of the deep dives that will come later on. But I think we're able to sort of conceptualize those risks of interdependence much more clearly now. And when we talk about cybersecurity, it's not just what affects our computer. As we did recently at Chatham House, we did a big study on the impact of cybersecurity on space networks. Yeah, we don't know the extent to which we rely on the connectivity through space for our terrestrial connectivity is massive. Cyber has not gone there in terms of risks. When it does, it could have a devastating impact. We talk about pandemics, we think of Ebola, but we've probably not fully computed yet the impact of antimicrobial resistance, something that this government studied quite effectively, the last government, but the British government studied effectively about 3 or 4 years ago, and which I understand is still at the top of the Foreign Office's list of global systemic risks. But it really is a niche issue for most people today. I don't want to be depressing about international terrorism. It's easy to be, but we have not seen its manifestation in the chemical, biological, and nuclear space yet. I'm afraid that is to come. And mass migration, I think we've seen the tip of an iceberg that's to come. These challenges cannot be fixed by any individual government, the Britons or any others. And the biggest challenge of all of these, of course, is the impact of climate change, its impact across the world on the energy transitions. And it's a conundrum which I don't see being easily resolved. I feel at the moment, I can talk more about it in the Q&A if you want, that we have governments that have pledged to a 2-degree future increase only of 2 degrees centigrade above figures in the late 90s, depending which government, where they take it. And yet, we don't have the models or the regulatory systems or the structures to deliver it. So there's a lot of rhetorical commitment, but if you look at the patterns, despite the great increases in renewable energies, really by 2030, the projections are doubling from 5% to 10% of global consumption by renewable energy. It might be high in the West, it might be high in Europe, it might be high in Britain, but it won't necessarily be high in China or India or other parts where the real global economic growth is going to increase over these coming days. And I could go on about water, etc. Now, the second part of these trends, will technology be the answer to everything? Because I do find myself probably sitting in that techno-optimistic world that the answer to all of these great challenges, which are all peaking and whose transition we've entered, ends up being technology. And even at Chatham House, we are in this weird situation where we've had people from governments, from companies, from the civil society come saying, can we play some of our convening role around the dangers of technology and their impacts on wealth, on work, on democracy, on privacy, this sense that somehow the technology is out of hand, that it's becoming a negative force in the world. When we look around the work we do, technology is providing almost in every case answers that we never had to public policy challenges. How do you deal with pandemics? Well, data sharing across borders is allowing massively quick responses that were not possible before. If you talk about the challenge of climate change, a lot of the answer actually will be through energy efficiency. Technology, data sharing, smart grids, distributed grids, these are being enabled by technology in a way that was never possible before. Women's engagement in the workforce in a meaningful way, not just in really menial types of work, which is the case in many parts of the world, could be absolutely revolutionized by the impacts of technology, allowing women business leaders to get into global supply chains through blockchain that cuts out middlemen, literally in that term, in ways that were never done before. Fantastic. But the reality is that we are absolutely at front end of that transition. What worries me is technology is imposing vicious changes in the way we understand the world that we're again at the front end of making that transition to. Just one stat on this, and I think it's from the McKinsey Global Institute. 50% of US jobs have a 65% likelihood of being fully automated or computerized by 2030. Now you can play around which sectors, and you know some of those, but it just gives you a sense there of how complex it'll be. And another complexity, we're all excited about electric vehicles. Finally, city centers may be less polluted, but the reality is they will need power. And those electrical vehicles are still going to be powered in the near term by fossil fuel plants. So, how will humanity interact with that technology revolution? The temptation for people like me, in my world, is to think about it, if I may say, rationally. Where are the opportunities versus the risks? How do you weigh them up? How do you balance one versus the other? But I fear that humanity is going to interact with technology emotionally, as human beings do, and not simply rationally as a logical opportunity where you massage the risks and you enable the opportunities. And why? Partly because technology is disrupting all of those institutions that have created the framework for our sense of psychological security in recent years. It is disrupting the sense of job security for the reasons I've described, but it is also completely disrupting the world of politics. The kind of tribal loyalties that we've used, especially in the West, around which to build our societies and organize our democratic societies. And when you think about the impact of technology through social media on that effect of tribalism, on almost hypercharging a search for a sense of certainty and of belonging and of psychological belonging, we can really see the feedstock of a return to nationalism, of a return to protectionism, and of some of the really darker sides of the early 20th century, being enabled by the very technology which offers such great rational opportunities at the economic and environmental and international levels. And that brings me, and I've got about 7 minutes to go, 20 minutes I was told, and then Q&A to 10:40, so I will finish up in the next 5-6 minutes. That takes me to the kind of geopolitical world, which many of you will be interested in, and again is the subject for one of the deep dives, I think, after this session. Theoretically, we should be moving into a world of geoeconomic competition. Geoeconomic, and I picked those terms carefully. The rise of China, which is principally rising and could be rising as an economic power, because it does not want to repeat the Thucydides trap, to put that as a shorthand for the rise of new powers against the resistance of older powers. It should be a period of geoeconomic competition, a return to what I said right at the beginning and to James's point of a rebalancing of the global economy quite fairly towards a population and not the aberration of the 1850s to the 1990s. But in practical terms, in real terms, it is likely to be a period of geopolitical tension, which may prove not manageable. And of course, the US and China are at the very heart of that dynamic. America has been trying to think politically of the rise of China geoeconomically, and engaging it in the WTO and so on was part of that story. But you can see, and we'll talk about it later, and you'll talk about it later, it is moving into a concept of geopolitical competition. America's sense that it is exceptional, and part of its exceptionalism is to be the leader of the world, is bumping up against China's sense of deep historical humiliation, and that it should be, by rights, at least an equal power in the world, and certainly not a second-tier power that has to fit into a pre-existing world order. And again, I haven't got time to talk about all my views of China, but I think we've been seeing in the rise of Xi Jinping a return to a Chinese model of what its future will be that is clearly not in sync with the world, the rational world, the theoretical world of geoeconomic competition and hopefully integration we thought about before. Russia is sitting there as a spoiler, it's loving it, this is great, but there's a sovereigntist country which really does think geopolitically always, and will always turn away economic gain in favor of sovereignty strength. And we're seeing a sort of return to strongman populism all over the world, international institutions not adapting. We no longer have a Europe-US leadership pole to sort of act as a counterweight to these forces. In a nutshell, we're living simultaneously in a world of 21st century opportunity and 19th century risk. And defense spending is the manifestation of this. 2.2% of global GDP today, but the bulk of that increase taking place 23 years in a row. You've had an increase in military expenditure in East Asia. I could go through the statistics. There isn't time for that. And there isn't time for me to talk about how some of those disruptions might play out. Maybe we can leave that for Q&A. Let me just turn to the UK, because otherwise I won't have time to to finish up. So a few comments on the UK. We are a symptom as much, and we may even be an agent and an actor in this big transition. You know, we, interestingly, were a canary in the mine, I think, with Brexit. It preceded Trump. You could argue, you know, echoes of this have been around for at least 10 or 15 years, but Brexit was that ringing bell. I'm not going to go into a whole Brexit why. What I would simply say is, whatever happens, whatever outcome we have, at least through the front end of this period we're looking at through 2030, we are going to be economically challenged. And the extent of that economic challenge will be determined by the nature of the deal we strike with the EU. We do have the capacity, I believe, to recapture past growth rates, to kind of engage with a relatively optimistic economic future in that sort of late 2020s through 2030 onward period. We have relatively favorable demographics. I think we have a work culture within large segments of British society that are powerful. We have, you know, the city, we have the language, we have all the things that you know, that famous list that's always put out there. But it is, you know, questioned about how open will we be as a society to immigration, to investment. How will we offset aspects of our aging population? And the UK itself will see a 30% increase in its over 65s by 2030, a doubling in its over 85s. And automation is going to hit us as any other country, especially in the retail sector, where we have a very large part of our employment. And as I said, I think we are an absolute symptom of that country whose destiny is not entirely in its own hands. We are banking, at least on the Brexit narrative, on the growth of those emerging markets. So the emerging markets will go through that positive geoeconomic adjustment, when, as I think I've described to you, I'm probably more worried about the emerging markets than I am even about what happens to us in the West. So what does that mean in terms of answers? We're going to have to fix ourselves in all of those areas that were our weaknesses that had nothing to do with leaving the EU, but which, now that we're leaving the EU, we may be forced to fix. It is an irony, but it may be a positive irony, whether it's on productivity, north-south divides, investment in infrastructure, investment in R&D, all of those areas that we're entirely in our own sovereign capacity to fix. When we're members of the EU, we may, now that we're leaving the EU, fix. Well, we now have to be frank. There is no alternative, to use the tired phrase. That will be important. We are going to have to be a contributor to the security of the West at a time, as I said, where geoeconomic competition may easily spill over into geopolitical competition. I believe that Europe will be, by 2030, unless we have a really cataclysmic Brexit, it will be inevitably our first circle of influence, our first circle of protection, our first circle of diplomatic focus. We have no choice. It's our neighbor. It's the part of the world through which all risk and all opportunity flows. And it has been thus even when we had our empire. So, you know, we will wake up to that reality again at some point, you know, just before or just after Brexit. We will need to sustain a very effective relationship with the United States, but ultimately, the strength of our relationship with the United States cannot be alternative to the strength of our relationship with Europe. If we don't have a strong relationship with Europe, we will be gamed by the United States. We're already being treated in a predatory way by the Trump administration. It'll get worse if we don't fix the first one before the second. And I suppose two last points I would make. We have to decide what are we going to contribute to this geopolitically challenged world. And I think the fundamental element, and it's being echoed by Jeremy Hunt quite actively since he's become Foreign Secretary, is this concept of the rules-based order. And there's only really one word in that, rules-based order. I didn't say liberal, I didn't say democratic. That may be more than we can contribute to this time. But whatever the political system of most countries around the world, they rely on the predictability of a rules-based order. Speaking of this in Oxford, it is what the British International Relations School talked about when they created the idea of an international society. where you sort of build up international law as far as governments are willing to take it, but by example, by practice, by habit, by transparency, you build up the capacity for stability despite the anarchical instincts of the world. And that role needs to be a fundamental world, I think, for Britain in these coming years. It is about building up sort of peer-to-peer based clubs. And there are many countries out there setting aside this kind of slight fantasy that emerging markets will be our saviors economically. But many emerging powers, or established powers even, will be our partners in this process. The US is always going to be exceptional and selective about international law. But countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, I'd say Germany, Sweden, I can pick a bunch of Europeans as well, are as invested in that system as we are. And we need to be contributors to that. And my last point here is I think we need to be also contributors to a more creative way of thinking about a rules-based order, one that doesn't just rely on institutions forcing this top-down, but that creates the infrastructure for societies, NGOs, companies, individuals to build it more from a bottom-up standpoint. And these are about coalitions between the private sector and the public sector. And again, I could go into those examples more later on. So to conclude, as a surface comment before your deep dives, everything is up in the air. We are in a free-for-all world. We're in a moment, though, where the choices we make over these next 12 years will determine not the world in 2030, but the world in 2050. And we will simply be dealing with stuff from now on if we don't make some pretty fundamental choices in the next 2 to 3 years. And I think that is therefore a perfect time for us to be having this conversation, because the UK, by ambition, by instinct, by size, to be frank, needs to be a player in that debate. So I'll stop there.